Hi, I'm guessing that you just recently found out JD Vance might be the next Vice President of the United States, or you might have heard that he f***ed the couch. He didn't, at least not in the book, but this book is nuts and a lot of shit happens in this that you probably need to know about. JD Vance and this book are intertwined. This is what introduced JD Vance to the national stage and the political sphere. Pundits and media personalities alike will often mention Hillbilly Elegy before they mention the fact he's a US Senator. Even Donald Trump mentioned the book in his announcement on Truth Social, and they all say the same thing too. It's a great book, it's a New York Times bestseller, it was on the top 100 list in 2016 and 2017. It single-handedly got him a job as a CNN contributor and a New York Times op-ed writer. But after reading this book, I'm kind of wondering if any of them have actually read it. And you know what? I read book. I like staring at pieces of paper for several hours at a time. However, I did not want to give this piece of shit any money, so I found a free PDF version online, and I'm going to roll with that. There is some viewer discretion advised. I will put timestamps throughout the video for you to skip through any sensitive topics. Yup.
Whether they're going to have a chance to live a materially better existence, or whether they're going to stay in the circumstances where they came from.
I officially accept your nomination to be Vice President of the United States of America.
Let's do just a quick overview of JD Vance if you have never heard of this guy. James Donald Bauman was born on August 2nd, 1984 in Middletown, Ohio. But he would take the last name of Mama and Papa once he got married to Usha. Even though he was born and raised in Middletown, he claims his hometown as Jackson, Kentucky, where his Mama and Papa were born and where he would visit often as a child. He would serve in the Marine Corps for 4 years after high school, and then attended Ohio State and then Yale Law School. He'd pass the bar exam, and then work under Peter Thiel at one of his venture capitalist firms in Silicon Valley. This is around the time that JD Vance published Hillbilly Elegy. The book gained major acclaim, especially amongst liberals trying to explain the 2016 election. He became a regular voice on CNN for Appalachia and the poor, even though he was a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. He'd initially positioned himself as a sort of never-Trumper Republican, although that would change around the time of the 2020 election. By that point, he had been Trump-pilled, and he was walking back everything he once said about Donald Trump. That includes, I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical asshole like Nixon, who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that he's America's Hitler. How's that for discouraging? Yeah, that is a bit discouraging, JD. Why are you his VP then? He would plead for a Trump endorsement once he moved back to Ohio and decided to run for US Senate.
It's time that I actually get on to making the announcement part. What is it? Oh.
And he got it. With an almost meaningless Trump endorsement under his belt, he would win by 6 points over everybody's favorite 2020 presidential candidate, Tim Ryan.
But you don't know.
Second of all,
You don't know that,
Second
Bernie.
of all,
We'll come to you in a second,
I do know,
Congressman.
and I wrote the damn bill.
In JD Vance's short time in the US Senate, he has become one of the most vocal critics of Joe Biden. This, mixed with his age and his relatively fresh national profile, apparently made him the best candidate for VP on the 2024 Republican ticket. What a perfect choice. So here we pretty much start with an introduction, setting up the premises of the book. He gives us a quick overview about his absurd life story, before stating, I'm not a senator, a governor, or a former cabinet secretary. I haven't started a billion-dollar company or a world-changing nonprofit. Thank you for already talking yourself down, man. That's making it a lot easier for me. He then gives us his first anecdotal story, the first out of a long list. So JD was working at a tile company over the summer between going to Ohio State and Yale, and at the time he worked with a guy named Bob, not to be confused with his adoptive father Bob, but that's besides the point. He was hired 4 months before JD and apparently developed a habit of taking long bathroom breaks. The manager would then hire Bob's pregnant girlfriends. Holy shit. Quote, "The girlfriend missed about every third day of work and never gave advance notice. Though warned to change her habits repeatedly, the girlfriend lasted no longer than a few months. Bob missed work about once a week, and he was chronically late. On top of that, he often took 3 to 4 daily bathroom breaks, each over half an hour. It became so bad that, by the end of our tenure, another employee and I made a game of it. We'd set a timer when he went to the bathroom and shout the major milestones throughout the warehouse. 35 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour. Eventually, Bob too was fired. When it happened, he lashed out at his manager. 'How could you do this to me? Don't you know I've got a pregnant girlfriend?' At least 2 other people, including Bob's cousin, lost their jobs or quit during my short time at the tile warehouse." I'll just preface this by saying it's kind of weird to time how long your coworkers are spending in the bathroom, and that's even if you think they're just like lollygagging or whatever. You don't know if this guy has like IBS or some shit. I think it's weird that you would do that instead of, I don't know, go to a manager or go to someone who's in charge. Also, advance notice, the third of the day's offer, she's pregnant. It's then followed by one of my favorite lines throughout the entire book. "To many analysts, terms like welfare queen conjure unfair images of the lazy black mom living on the dole. Readers of this book will realize quickly that there is little relationship between that specter and my argument. I have known many welfare queens. Some were my neighbors, and all of them were white." Yeah, the Reaganites are wrong for conjuring this image of black women as welfare queens. It's all poor people. And no, there is a very real racial undertone to Hillbilly Elegy, which we'll talk about later. He goes on, "The book is not an academic study. My primary aim is not to convince you of a documented problem. My primary aim is to tell you a true story about what the problem feels like when you're born with it hanging around your neck." Now, JD, we already know that you're too dumb to make an academic study. We weren't thinking that. Because instead of good research or data, it's replaced by anecdotal stories that are either greatly exaggerated or entirely fabricated. And all to say that the lack of opportunity and the lack of work within Appalachia and the Midwest is actually a cultural and societal problem rather than an economic problem. But now, let's get into the first few chapters, which mainly focuses on welcome, ladies and gents, to somehow the most confusing and least confusing part of this book. The Blanton family tree is very interesting for the fact that JD takes up the first 3 chapters telling us about these people, but they never really show up throughout the book. Why we need to know about these people, I'm not sure. And let's start here. Mama. Not the Mama that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this book. Her mother. I don't know why she's also called Mama. So Mama Blanton had 7 kids. 4 boys and 3 girls. Uncle T-Berry is probably the one we talk about the least. He's the oldest out of the bunch, and he died when JD was relatively young. His name's not T-Berry, by the way. He's called that because he's named after a chewing gum. I don't know. The only memory he has of Uncle T-Berry is being chased with a switchblade and being threatened to get his ear cut off and thrown to the dogs. And then there's Uncle Pet, who is probably the most financially well off out of the Blanton bunch. He still sucks though. He cut someone open with an electric saw just because his mother was insulted. Like, yeah, don't insult a guy's mother, but also don't cut someone open with an electric saw. And apparently he didn't go to jail because the other guy knew that he couldn't go to the police because he insulted another guy's mother. No! Go to the police! And there's Uncle David, who's like this kind of hippie type guy. He introduces JD to marijuana when he's 12. We'll not talk about that. Then there's Uncle Gary, who I honestly forgot about, and I'm not going to go back into the book and find out. And then Aunt Betty is probably mentioned once in the book. She don't matter. Aunt Rosie also kind of doesn't matter. What we have to look at is right here. So Mamaw. This is the Mamaw that we are going to actually worry about today. Mamaw started dating Papaw at 14, and then she got pregnant, so they moved to Middletown, Ohio. At 14, they ended up having 3 kids. Uncle Jimmy, Bev, who is JD's mom, and then Aunt Wee, whose real name is Lori. Why they call her Aunt Wee? Not necessarily sure. Bev has had multiple husbands over the span of the book. I'm probably going to mention them once and you'll never hear about them again, so I'm not going to write them down. But JD and Lindsay are Bev's kids, with 2 different people, but they are Bev's kids. And that's why JD and Lindsay, despite having many half-siblings and step-siblings at a given time, have a good relationship with each other. So yeah, that's the family tree. You are only going to need to know about like these 4 people. I don't know why JD Vance dedicated so much time to all of these people. Oh, and I almost forgot about Tilden Blanton. Tilden Blanton is an ancestor of JD Vance. Tilden Blanton killed a family rival, Demosthenes Noble, on election day in front of the polling place, no less. His father would win the county attorneyship, and Tilden never went to jail for murder. That just shows that corruption runs in the blood. I forgot, Papaw's side of the family, the Vance side of the family, also started the McCoy-Hetfield feud, which if you don't know, that's one of the biggest like family feuds in world history. So both families are really good at starting shit. Alright, and with that, I'll actually get into the substance of the book now. Sorry about that. Alright, ladies and gents, I decided that this would be way more fun if we were playing Sims while we talked about this. Let's see if we can make ourselves a little JD Vance. So in the previous chapter, we talked about Mamaw and Papaw meeting. He was 17, she was 13, 14, around the time she got pregnant. And that's what necessitated their move to Middletown, Ohio. So Papaw was an FDR-style Democrat, while Mamaw just believed that politicians were just a bunch of crooks. He considers Mamaw's politics as simpleton, which I think is kind of insulting. Papaw would only vote for Republicans once, and that was in the 1980 election. He hated Walter Mondale that much. Okay, I think that's his hairstyle. So one holiday season, a young Uncle Jimmy would wander his way into a pharmacy in order to play with a toy that he saw. The store clerk, being kind of rude, picked it out of his hand and told him to get out of the store. He would later tell Papaw what happened, and both of his parents would confront the store clerk. "This toy?" Papaw asked, picking up the toy. When the clerk nodded, Papaw smashed it on the ground. Utter chaos ensued. As Uncle Jimmy explained, they went nuts. Dad threw another one of the toys across the store and moved towards the clerk in a very menacing way. Mom started grabbing shit off the shelves and throwing it all over the place. She's screaming, "Kick his fucking ass! Kick his fucking ass!" And then Dad leads into the clerk and says very clearly, "If you say another word to my son, I will break your fucking neck." This poor guy was completely terrified, and I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The man apologized, and the Vances continued with their Christmas shopping as if nothing happened. So yes, even in the best of times, Mamaw and Papaw struggled to adapt. So we're only about 2 chapters into the book, and he's already admitted his family has been involved in a lot of attempted murders and and now a bunch of property damage, and apparently now it's physically and verbally threatening a store clerk over a toy? Imagine all the other people who are watching that happen as well. That's crazy. In the introduction, he said that there are no villains in this story, and I think I have to disagree with him. But we'll get into that later. Chapter 3 focuses more on the family dynamic between Mamaw, Papaw, and the 3 kids. It's around this time that Papaw starts drinking and in turn starts becoming a bit violent. I forgot to put in his name. James David Vance. He will have they them pronouns. So Mamaw says if Papaw came home drunk one more time that she would kill him. And in the ultimate showing of love and affection, he would come home drunk and pass out on the couch. And in return, she would go out to the garage, get a gas canister, pour it all over his chest, light a match, and throw it on him. So yeah, actually attempted murder. And he did survive. He's in the rest of the book, at least up till chapter 7. And who put him out, you might ask? It wasn't Mamaw. It was the children. I don't know, man. That just kind of sounds messed up. That's kind of scarring. Lori and Jimmy would be troubled within their youths, of one falling into drugs and the other falling into an abusive relationship. However, later in life turned their lives around. Bev, JD's mom, on the other hand, was a star student in school, but she got pregnant at 18, which forced her to not pursue higher education. She would fall into drugs herself, which we'll talk about in later chapters. This change is a symptom of a new economic reality, rising residential segregation. The number of working-class whites in higher poverty neighborhoods is growing. In 1970, 25% of white children lived in a neighborhood with poverty rates above 10%. In 2000, the number was 40%. It's almost certainly even higher today. Compared to 2000, residents of extreme poverty neighborhoods in 2005 to 2009 were more likely to be white, native-born, high school or college graduates, homeowners, and not receiving public assistance. In other words, bad neighborhoods no longer plague only urban ghettos. The bad neighborhood has spread to the suburbs. Now, that first part of the argument makes total sense if he does want to argue poor people in general just face a lack of upwards mobility. He chose a very specific time frame where something very big in the economic world happens, but I can't necessarily put my finger on it right now. But he has to bring white people specifically into this, and that's kind of weird because the Brookings quote continues. It reads, "However, black residents continue to comprise the largest share of the population in these neighborhoods, 45%, and over 2/3 of residents had a high school diploma or less." Why are you misrepresenting data to try and make it seem like white people are now getting the shortest end of the stick when it comes to poverty? Something that affects all races, but misproportionately affects people of color. And since you like to compare Scots-Irish to African Americans so much in this book, the fact that you left it out is kind of silly. Because if you included it, your point wouldn't make as much sense. JD then introduces some of the father figures in his life, but none of them particularly matter, and they often change without him saying anything. So that definitely makes the book a little bit harder to follow. There's Don Bauman, who's his namesake, and honestly, he has no relationship with. He hardly shows up in the book. The most notable one is probably Bob Hamill, who's not to be mistaken with Bob from the Tile Warehouse, and he by far gets the most time within the book. I believe he's also JD's adoptive father, so I mean, yeah. And then there's others, but I'm not going to talk about them because they really do not matter. Look at him, he looks like a little elf. Let's like put a little Santa hat on him. Aw, look at him, little guy. JD noticed some kid named Chris making fun of another kid, to which JD told him to shut up and just leave him alone. And Chris said, "What are you going to do about it?" And so JD, showing what he was going to do about it, sucker punched the kid in the stomach, causing them to fall to their knees and cough up blood. Did a young JD Vance just cause a kid internal bleeding? Chris went to the school nurse, and after I confirmed that I hadn't killed him and would avoid the police, My thoughts immediately turned to the school justice system, whether I'd be suspended or expelled and for how long. While the other kids played at recess and Chris recovered with the school nurse, the teacher brought me into the classroom. I thought she was going to tell me that she called my parents and I'd be kicked out of school. Instead, she gave me a lecture about fighting and made me practice my handwriting instead of playing outside. I detected a hint of approval from the teacher, and I sometimes wonder if there were class politics at work in her inability to appropriately discipline the class bully. At any rate, Mama found out about the fight directly from me and praised me for doing something really good. It was the last time I ever got into a fist fight. Like, yeah, okay, he stood up to the bully, but at what cost? Giving the little kid hemoptysis or some shit. What should be his aspiration? I'm gonna make him a master chef. Hell yeah. He's a goofball.
Well, they say it's racist to do anything. I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday, and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too, but it's good. I love you guys.
He's unflirty. Did he shit himself? Wait, what? I need to redo that. Did he shit himself? Oh, that's just very unfortunate. Okay. Alright, and I'm going to have him jealous.
He was also asked yesterday if you were ready to be president on day one. He kind of dodged the question. What do you still have to do as his running mate to prove to him that you are ready to step into that role?
Well, I think Donald Trump was answering a political question, and he was answering it correctly. He said for years that who the vice president is doesn't really matter politically. Most Americans are voting either for Kamala Harris or for Donald Trump. They're not voting for the vice presidential nominee of either party. Look, I'm absolutely ready to be president on day one. I've been a businessman. I've been a United States Marine. I've been a senator. I can do the job, but politically, he's just right. People are voting for Donald Trump, primarily.
There we are. Okay, that sounds about right. Can this sim use the toilet standing? Well, JD Vance seems like the kind of guy to sit down while peeing and then moan while wiping, so I'm gonna put no. During one of my second grade football games, a tall, overweight mother muttered about why I had been given the ball on a previous play. Mom, a bleacher row behind the woman, overheard the comment and told her that I'd been given the ball because, unlike her child, I wasn't a fat piece of shit who'd been raised by a fat piece of shit mother. By the time I observed the commotion on the sidelines, Bob was ripping Mom away with the woman's hair still clenched in her hands. After the game, I asked Mom what happened, and she replied only, "No one criticizes my boy." I beamed with pride. You mean she just assaulted somebody at your second grade football game? And you just said that Appalachian folk know better than to speak badly about somebody's mother? And she just spoke badly about a mother to a mother's face. That's like asking for even more trouble, isn't it? I don't get these people, man. Chapter 5 ends with JD revealing that his mother has started to party more and in turn started using more drugs and alcohol. That is so loud. Holy shit. To make it up to him, she took JD to the mall to get football cards. Apparently on the way to the mall, JD got on her temper and started speeding up to 100 miles per hour. Then threatening to crash the car and kill both her and JD. He would continue so that she would then pull over, which she did, but it was to try and beat the shit out of him. So he got out of the car, ran across a large field of grass to avoid her. He would find this rural house, which he saw someone in the backyard pull and begged them for help. She brought him into the house, locked the door, and called the police. His mother would quickly break down the door and start dragging JD out, but by that time the police had showed up onto the scene and successfully ended the situation. JD would not press charges on his mother in order to keep her out of jail, and she would actually retain custody of him, which is kind of fucked up. Hey neighbor, do you want to learn how you can make a difference? If you got a minute, I'd love to chat with you about how your vote can help make this neighborhood more green. That's the exact opposite of what he wants, but okay. In chapter 6, we find out about his fascination with his sister, as well as the time he almost became a model. Let's read. Lindsay has always been a beautiful girl. When my friends and I ranked the world's prettiest girls, I listed Lindsay first, just ahead of Demi Moore and Pam Anderson. You ranked your sister prettier than any other reasonable childhood crush? Okay. I wondered how many talent agents could ever appreciate my sister's beauty. Eventually, we reached the front of the line, and the talent agent seemed optimistic about my sister. She said something about how cute she was, and told her to go wait in another room. Surprisingly, she said that I was model material too. JD Vance, the absolute beast of a man that he is, was told that he could possibly be a model. Are you saying that we could have seen JD Vance walk down the runway strutting his stuff instead of the RNC stage? But the event actually ended up being a scam, and it would cost them a hefty trip to New York City to move on. So JD had to give up on his dreams of being a model. But hey, at least he has a hot sister. I don't know. Oh no. What are you going to do now? What does she want to talk about? Oh no, voting. I'll never forget the time I convinced myself that I was gay. I was 8 or 9, maybe younger, and I stumbled upon a broadcast by some fire and brimstone preacher. The man spoke about the evils of homosexuals, how they had infiltrated our society, and how they were all destined for hell absent of serious repenting. At the time, the only thing I knew about gay men was that they preferred men to women. This described me perfectly. I disliked girls, and my best friend in the world was my buddy Bill. Oh no, I'm going to hell. I broached this issue with Mama, confessing that I was gay, and I was worried that I would burn in hell. She said, "Don't be a fucking idiot. How do you know that you're gay?" I explained my thought process. Mama chuckled and seemed to consider how she might explain to a boy my age. Finally, she asked, "JD, do you want to suck dicks?" I was flabbergasted. Why would someone want to do that? She repeated herself, and I said, "Of course not." Then she said, "You're not gay, and even if you wanted to suck dicks, that would be okay. God would still love you." Okay, that's cool and all, Mama, but would you still love him? What's poppin', gamers? This is Editing Sam, and I found something I probably should have added. It was easy to be a Christian. The only affirmative teachings I remember drawing from church was that I shouldn't cheat on my wife and that I shouldn't be afraid to preach the gospel to others. So I planned a life of monogamy and tried to convert other people, even my 7th grade science teacher who was a Muslim. And then he continues about his obsession with like the Left Behind books and end times, which is kind of concerning, but okay. But yeah, that's all I got it to add. In Chapter 7, we find out that Papa has passed away. They would end up having to break into his house by throwing a rock through a back window. At this point, he was living separately from Mama, which makes sense. If I was lit on fire by my wife, I'd probably want to move out too. Probably followed by divorce, but hey, not judging. It's after that we find out some new information of Papa. JD recounts a time where Papa threatens to kill Aunt Wee's dog by feeding it a steak marinated in antifreeze. And apparently, 3 decades earlier, he did the same thing to a neighbor's dog. Remember when he said that there are no villains in this story? We're not even halfway through. The only 2 things I've learned is that the middle class is lazy and that the Vance family is insane. And finally, we also learned that Mama and her friend broke into a pallbearer's office at her brother's funeral and successfully located a spicy magazine in his personal belongings. They were going to take that and then send that to the pallbearer's wife. I cannot imagine being that much of an asshole. Yeah, these people kind of suck. Alright, welcome to the bed. That's something JD Vance has never muttered in his life. So I'd like to take a little bit of time here to talk about JD's weird relationship with addiction. I think the way he talks about addiction is pretty dismissive. Bev took Papa's death harder than the rest of the family, mainly because she feels he was the only one who understood her. It led to some sort of mental breakdown in the coming days. A few days after the funeral, I walked onto Mama's front porch, looked down the street, and saw an incredible commotion. Mom was standing in a bath towel in her front yard, screaming at the only people who truly loved her. To Matt, "You're a fucking loser nobody." To Lindsay, "You're a selfish bitch. He was my dad, not yours, so stop acting like you just lost your father." To Tammy, her unbelievably kind friend who was secretly gay, "The only reason you act like my friend is because you want to fuck me." I ran over and begged Mom to calm down. By then, a police cruiser was already on the scene. I arrived on the front porch as a police officer grabbed Mom's shoulders and collapsed onto the ground, struggling and kicking. Then the officer grabbed Mom and carried her to the cruiser, and she fought the whole way. There was blood on the porch, and someone said that she tried to cut her wrists. I don't think the officer arrested her, though I didn't know what happened. Mamaw arrived on the scene and took Lindsay and me with her. I remember thinking if Papaw was here, he would know what to do. A year earlier, Mom had lost her job at Middletown Hospital after rollerblading through the emergency room. At the time, I saw Mom's bizarre behavior as a consequence of her divorce from Bob. Similarly, Mamaw's occasional references to Mom getting loaded seemed like random comments of a woman knowing for her willingness to say anything, not a diagnosis of a deteriorating reality. Not long after Mom lost her job, during my trip to California, I heard from her just once. I had no idea that behind the scenes, the adults, meaning Mamaw on one hand and Uncle Jimmy and his wife Aunt Donna on the other, were debating whether I should move permanently to California. Mom flailing and screaming in the street was the culmination of the things I hadn't seen. She'd begun taking prescription narcotics not long after we moved to Preble County. I believe the problem started with a legitimate prescription, but soon enough, Mom was stealing from her patients and getting so high that turning an emergency room into a skating rink seemed like a good idea. She regularly recited the Serenity Prayer, a staple of addiction circles in which the faithful ask God for the serenity to accept things they cannot change. Drug addiction was a disease, and just as I wouldn't judge a cancer patient for a tumor, so I shouldn't judge a narcotics addict for her behavior. At 13, I found this patently absurd, and Mom and I often argued over whether her newfound wisdom was scientific truth or an excuse for people whose decisions destroyed a family. He continues, oddly enough, it's probably both. Research does reveal a genetic disposition for substance abuse, but those who believe their addiction is a disease show less of an inclination to resist it. Mom was telling herself the truth, but the truth was not setting her free. Well, that doesn't change the truth, or indicate that you need to hide the truth in some way to get better. When he talks about it as a disease later on in the chapter, he puts it in quotations, indicating that he still doesn't believe that it's a disease or a disorder. While it is in some way a central aspect of the book, it's also a central aspect of his Senate campaign. Robin Harris, who is the leader of the Gallia Jackson Meigs Board of Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services, rolls right off the tongue, asked him what he envisioned as an effective method of drug prevention, to which he replied, "How would I know? As a public official who's running for office on this issue, that should never be your response." What I'm getting from this is that JD does not care about the opioid crisis or addiction in general, even though he will take time to write an entire book about it and run an entire Senate campaign on it. He ended up skipping a lot of class, which ended up with letters coming home asking about unexcused absences. Since Mom was in the treatment center, and since Mamaw was not technically their legal guardian, Lindsay ended up forging their signature. And so the letters stopped getting sent home, and JD would almost flunk out of 8th grade with a 2.1 GPA. And with that, I want to get to the most important part of this story. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 gets its own section because it serves as the essential argument of Hillbilly Elegy. In other words, this is what JD is trying to teach us with this book. In this chapter, his mother asks him to pee in a cup, which in turn we find out that she is back on drugs. He initially says no, wanting his mom to face the ramifications for her actions. But after a short talk with Mamaw, he would give in. That same day, he'd come home from school and find out that he'd be moving in with Mamaw permanently, which I think should have happened a long time ago. He'd stay there until he graduate high school, and one of the first things he talks about is Mamaw's love for Tony Soprano. This is when he gets a job at a local grocery store, an experience which he describes as him becoming an amateur sociologist, aka just being incredibly classist to everybody who walks by. He goes on about how poorer Americans are more likely to get baby formula, or more likely to be hairy. He notices the clothes that they wear is of less pristine condition. At this job, he gains both a disdain for the rich and the poor. The rich because he gains a disdain for the store owners and the customers who are able to have like a $4,000 tab, while it's likely that the poorer customers won't even have a tab in general. Let me tell you why he doesn't like the poor. This is actually my favorite part. Let's read. They'd ring up their orders separately, buying food with food stamps and beer, wine, and cigarettes with cash. They'd regularly go through the checkout line speaking on their cell phone. I could never understand why our lives felt like such a struggle, while those living off the government largesse enjoyed trinkets that I only dreamed about. Mamaw listened intently to my experience at Dillman's. We began to view much of our fellow working class with mistrust. Most of us were struggling to get by, but we made do, worked hard, and hoped for a better life. But a large minority was content to live off the dole. Every 2 weeks I'd get a small paycheck and notice the line where federal and state income taxes were deducted from my wages. At least as often, our drug addict neighbor would buy T-bone steaks, which I was too poor to buy for myself, but was forced by Uncle Sam to buy for someone else. It was my first indication that the policies of Mamaw's Party of the Working Man, the Democrats, weren't all that they cracked up to be. This one moment, right here, perfectly describes Hillbilly Elegy. It's JD, pretending to be a sociologist, making such large assumptions about people's financial situations. You don't know whether they own a car or a house. You don't know how many dependents they have. You don't know anything about them. And what do you want them to spend their money on if it's not food or a cell phone? JD, do you want them to invest in an index fund? And you're not far less angry about it nowadays, because in 2016 you're dedicating an entire chapter to it in your book. Second, if you have a job or, I don't know, children, JD, maybe it necessitates them having a phone. And that brings me back to saying there is a reason this book is called a memoir and not a work of sociology or an academic study. Because there's no research, it's just a guy being mad that he doesn't have a Nokia. And in turn, he's using that to argue that Appalachian people are dumb and lazy, and that the economic decline that they're facing right now is self-inflicted. Essentially, this book was created to tell poor people it's a skill issue. He argues that there are two types of working class people: the hardworking, elbow-greased, no-complaint worker like Mamaw and Papaw, and the always blame the government welfare queen like his mom. This is when he starts mentioning the new Section 8 residents in Middletown, Ohio, who Mamaw saw as bad people bound to draw down property values. He then describes a single mother who moved in which Mamaw states, she's a lazy whore, but she wouldn't be if she was forced to get a job. Do you guys like Mamaw? 'Cause I don't. She almost killed a guy at 12, lit her husband on fire, and now committed however many crimes, now to call a single mother on public assistance a lazy whore. And while the later paragraphs try to dismiss this sentiment that Mamaw has, we can't act like this chapter wasn't an exact agreement. JD starts taking to the ideas of economic decline, reading whatever books he could get his hands on. This is when JD starts citing some of his original inspirations, which include Charles Murray. Welcome to everybody's favorite talk show, Who is That Racist? Charles Murray is a scholar who's most known for his controversial sociological works. He spent a great deal of his career arguing that minorities were genetically inferior to white people, using scientific racism to back up his points. His most famous work, The Bell Curve, is 900 pages of analysis on factors that influence human intelligence. A great portion of the book is devoted to arguing that there is a direct correlation between race and IQ. His sources are often white nationalists and eugenicists, and consequently his work is often cited and used as scientific proof by more white nationalists and eugenicists. The book Losing Ground, which JD mentions reading in Hillbilly Elegy, is 300 pages of Murray blaming poverty on governmental welfare, because that makes total sense. He does that while also continuing to argue that minorities are genetically disadvantaged to be poor. Which is it? His work has been largely discredited, and right now he is an outcast within sociology. But as I said, JD Vance is a huge fan. So much so,
They met for a recorded 1-hour sit-down at the American Enterprise Institute on the subject of Hillbilly Elegy, no less. Vance citing such a controversial figure as his main influence so publicly is troubling, especially if he shares the same views as Murray. And he's totally aware of this scientific racism community when he said this on CNN.
But one thing that worries me is that we're trying to paint this white nationalist movement as a movement primarily of poor and working class Americans, when the truth is that the alt-right is actually led by better educated and frankly pretty well-to-do people. So this is not a problem for just people from my community. It's actually mostly a problem, I think, for those who are doing pretty well, who have good educations and good jobs.
And that's not the only uncomfortable relationship he has with a white nationalist. As Richard Hall at The Independent covered greatly, he follows many notable white nationalists on Twitter. Pretty much, this guy is a scientific racist who both cites and incites white nationalists to continue believing a false reality. And JD Vance clearly has ties to these movements influenced by Murray, by hosting talks with them and following them on social media. Who is that racist?
Rather than proving with your own life story that there are smart, hardworking, humble people within Appalachia like yourself, you choose to verify the stereotype in the hopes of being accepted by Silicon Valley venture capitalists. To wrap this up, fuck you, JD Vance, and fuck you, Mama. You both hate the poor. I know a lot just happened, so let's just go back to making fun of JD for a little bit. Chapter 10 begins with JD not making his high school golf team, which is like the widest thing to be sad about. Mama wanted him to do it because she knows that rich people like to hang out at golf places. He graduated from high school, he finally recovered from his grades that I talked about previously, and now his plan was to go to Ohio State. But then 9/11 happened. This is what prompted JD to turn to the Marines. JD explains his decision, saying, "Like any self-respecting hillbilly, I considered heading to the Middle East to kill terrorists. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to do it. And I knew that if I waited too long, I'd talk myself out of enlisting. So 2 weeks later, as the crisis turned into the Iraq War, I signed my name on a dotted line and promised the Marine Corps the first 4 years of my adult life." JD would be sent to boot camp in North Carolina. At this point, JD got unfathomably humbled by his drill sergeant. What I'm about to read confirms that I could never be in the Marine Corps. Not because I don't think I could hang, but I'd laugh my fucking ass off if I saw this. During the first meal of boot camp, I grabbed the offered piece of cake and marched to my seat. If nothing else tastes good, I thought, this cake shall certainly be the exception. Then my drill instructor, a skinny white man with a Tennessee twang, stepped in front of me. He looked up and down with his small, intense eyes and offered a query. "You really need that cake, don't you, fat ass?" I prepared to answer, but the question was apparently rhetorical, as he smacked the cake out of my hands and moved on to the next victim. I never grabbed the cake again. JD continues to talk about how the military changed him and how when he came home, he began to count his calories and change his diet and wouldn't like a lot of his old favorite foods. It would also help Mama's rising premiums with earnings that he got from playing online poker, which is something, I guess. He then talks about Terminator 2 and how Mama saw Arnold Schwarzenegger as the embodiment of the American dream, which he goes on a bit too long about that. While JD was stationed at base in North Carolina, Mama's lung collapses and she falls into a coma. He would then drive dangerously fast to get back home, being pulled over in West Virginia for going 94 miles in a 65. And the officer was just like, "All good, man. There's no speed traps for the next 70 miles. I took my warning ticket, thanked him profusely, and drove 102 until I crossed the state line. I made a 13-hour trip in just under 11 hours. When he got there, they explained that it was Aunt Wee's decision to take her off life support, which she did die that night. Her home equity was used to pay off substantial debts, with the rest of it being split up between Uncle Jimmy, Aunt Wee, JD, and Lindsay, entirely cutting Bev out of the situation. JD made a point that he didn't cry until he was on his way back to boot camp, and how he almost spinned out of control on a mountainous road while that happened. He would enjoy his time in the Marines. He would learn how to manage his finances and would actually buy a car. It talked about how it shaped him into being the wide-jawed man he is today. As a friend joked, I had a face for radio and I wasn't prepared for live TV interviews about happenings on base. The Marine Corps threw me to the wolves. I struggled a bit at first, allowing some photographers to take photos of a classified aircraft, speaking out of turn at a meeting with senior officers, and I got my ass chewed. After finishing up his 4 years in the Marines, it was finally time for him to attend Ohio State. You might think I skipped over a lot of his time in the Marines, but that's kind of the extent of what he talks about. Chapter 11 focuses on JD's new college experience, meeting new friends, getting new classes, and gaining a new drive from learning, especially from his time in the Marines. He would study so hard, in fact, that he actually developed numerous health problems. Did I take it too far? Absolutely. I didn't sleep enough. I drank too much and ate Taco Bell at nearly every meal. A week into what I thought was really just an awful cold, a doctor told me that I had mono. I ignored him and kept on living as though NyQuil and DayQuil were magical elixirs. After a week of this, my urine turned a disgusting brown shade, and my temperature registered 103 degrees. I realized that I might need to take care of myself, so I downed some Tylenol, drank a couple of beers, and went to sleep. When Mom found out what was happening, she drove to Columbus and took me to the emergency room. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't even a practicing nurse, but she took it as a point of pride to supervise every interaction we had with the healthcare system. She asked the right questions, got annoyed with doctors when they didn't answer directly, and made sure I had what I needed. I spent 2 full days in the hospital as doctors emptied 5 bags of saline to rehydrate me, and discovered that I had contracted a staph infection in addition to the mono, which explained why I grew so sick. The doctors released me to Mom, who wheeled me out of the hospital and took me home to recover. How do you study so hard that you get mono and a staph infection? He lost 20 pounds from this. This is like summa cum laude Ozempic. It's during this year he gets into a class discussion with a 19-year-old with a hideous beard who believes certain things about the Iraq War. He explained that those fighting the war were typically less intelligent than those, like him, who immediately went to college. It showed, he argued, in the wanton way soldiers butchered and disrespected Iraqi civilians. It was an objectively terrible opinion. My friends from the Marine Corps spanned the political spectrum and held nearly every conceivable opinion about the war. Many of my Marine Corps friends were staunch liberals who had no love for our commander-in-chief, then George W. Bush, and felt that we had to sacrifice too much for too little gain. As the student prattled on, I thought about the never-ending training about how to respect Iraqi culture, never show anyone the bottom of your foot, never address a woman in a traditional Muslim garb without first speaking to a male relative. I thought about the security we provided to Iraqi Okay, you already get the point. You get the point. While that guy's argument is stupid, I'm also fairly certain that that's just a straw man argument. Your personal experience is valuable. I'm not doubting that, especially if you are an esteemed Marine who acts in good nature. However, especially from the Iraq War, there is so many documented amounts of war crimes that the US has committed. How much we subjected people to cruel and unusual punishment. How many times we violated the Geneva Convention, we still don't even know. Even infringing on the basic human rights of regular everyday Iraqis. And that's one of the main reasons that modern conservatives do not embrace the Bushes or the Iraq War. That was half of Trump's jabs at Jeb Bush in 2016, and why you mentioned Joe Biden voting for the Iraq War in your RNC speech, while also forgetting to mention that you fought in it. The mental gymnastics for you to have these politics after all you've been through, kind of crazy. At Yale, he felt incredibly out of place, especially as one of the only kids who came from his type of background. There is this certain professor that looked down on people who went to state schools or non-Ivy League schools in general, really. He would then try and write a paper to impress this teacher, which he managed to do successfully. He then talks about his struggle with upwards mobility, because even though he's going to where he wants to go, He's leaving his old community and in some ways leaving his old self behind. After a few weeks of flirtation and a single date, I told her that I was in love with her. It violated every rule of modern dating I'd learned as a young man, but I didn't care. This is his first love interest throughout the entire book, by the way, so I'm perceiving this as his first relationship. And if so, He talks about the multiple interviews, banquets, and whatnot that he has to attend while going to Yale Law School. He's doing interviews for law firms, judges, and trying out extracurriculars like the Yale Journal. He then reveals his true political hero, Mitch Daniels. As a Hoosier who's lived under Mitch Daniels for almost half of my life, I hate Mitch Daniels. Now it makes sense why I have such a disdain for JD's politics. Chapter 14 starts with Usha saying that JD looks like a turtle, which is kind of funny. I mean, she uses it metaphorically, but I think he kind of looks like a turtle. She explains how he withdraws completely after just a hint of disagreement. She tried to comfort him after a poor interview performance, and he just blew up on her. But thankfully, they made up, and in front of Ford's Theater, no less. Yeah, that Ford's Theater. He then has a little section on adverse childhood experiences, or ACE, which I think is good to be included in this kind of book. This is probably the most compact chapter in terms of actual information, research, and data. He ends off the chapter by stating that at this point he hadn't spoken to his mother in several months, the longest drought that they've ever had. Chapter 15 follows JD at a shady motel in Ohio, purchasing a place for his mother to stay so that she is not homeless for the week. I tried to call a Middletown hotel and give them my credit card information. The cost for a week was $150, and I figured that would give us time to come up with a plan, but they wouldn't accept my card over the phone. So at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, I drove from Cincinnati to Middletown to keep Mom from homelessness. People sometimes ask whether I think there's anything we can do to solve the problems of my community. I know what they're looking for, a magical public policy solution or an innovative governmental program, but these problems of family, faith, and culture aren't like a Rubik's Cube, and I don't think that solutions, as most understand the term, really exist. A good friend who worked for a time in the White House and cares deeply about the plight of the working class once told me, the best way to look at this might be to recognize that you probably can't fix these things. They'll always be around. But maybe you could put your thumb on the scale a little for the people at the margins. I mean, sure, there's not a policy that necessarily solves all of these problems in one, nor is there a policy that can really solve a cultural problem. But as we've stated earlier, most of these are economic problems. Thinking back to the "how would I know" comment, I cannot believe how someone with this little trust in public policy decides to run for office. He then talks about some of the good role models around him, which I really don't know who you were talking about. You didn't put them in the book. And the conclusion pretty much echoes the major ideas of this story. I believe we hillbillies are the toughest goddamned people on this earth. We take an electric saw to the hide of those who insult our mother. We make young men costume cotton undergarments to protect a sister's honor. But are we tough enough to do what needs to be done to help a kid like Brian? Are we tough enough to build a church that forces kids like me to engage with a world rather than withdraw from it? Are we tough enough to look ourselves in the mirror and admit that our conduct harms our children? Public policy can help, but there is no government that can fix these problems for us. So he takes a break from calling poor people dumb, lazy, and useless to now bring us all together. He calls for a change of our conduct because no government can solve it. And as we know, JD also accepts he doesn't know how to solve the problem, which is great for a vice presidential nominee. It's not like they can raise the minimum wage or invest in small business or subsidies to create new renewable energy jobs in previous mining towns as just one example of diversity in economic output, or maybe end tariffs on items mainly consumed by. I know what I must do. we're done with the book, I think it's finally time for me to give my rating. I'll give it a 1 out of 10. I do find some parts relatable, as I come from a similar background as JD, and there are some lighthearted moments, even though that's not what the book's necessarily about. JD's story is incredibly unique. His rise through the social ladder is almost unimaginable for most, and that's something you can't take away from him. My problem is that now right-wingers are framing this book as some sort of esteemed work of sociology, even though it's barely a memoir. Compared to some other memoirs I've read with political undertones, this is the one that is most detached from reality. He's less a voice for Appalachia or hillbillies, and is more a voice for their stereotype. I talked about there being some racial undertones in this book, and if you didn't pick up on it, then I don't know how, because this is JD pretty much pitching the idea of hillbillies being their own race. There is an ethnic component lurking in the background of my story. In our race-conscious society, our vocabulary often extends no further than color of someone's skin. Black people, Asians, white privilege. Sometimes these broad categories are useful, but to understand my story, you have to delve into the details. I may be white, but I do not identify with the WASPs of the Northeast. Instead, I identify with the millions of working-class Americans of Scot-Irish descent who have no college degree. Buddy, you went to Yale. He then continues to compare the Scots-Irish to black people, the plight of whom is not comparable whatsoever. The Scots-Irish were among the first early Western expansionists, surely facing economic turmoil themselves, but they never faced restricted laws on the basis of them being Scots-Irish. Africans were brought here against their will and then subject to centuries of restrictive laws on the basis of their race, in turn influencing the economic and social structures that we still have today. And hey, if you're going to be in the comment section being, actually, you need to take a long look in the mirror and breathe. Remember that clip I played earlier during the Who Is That Racist segment of Charles Murray sitting down with JD Vance? The subject that they were talking about was using the hillbilly card. What is that even supposed to mean? Is nobody else flabbergasted by this? Why is nobody talking about this? I hope this video well documented JD's disdain for the poor, especially those from his own community. I already went into depth in chapter 9 about the crux of it, but I will say that this book should be called Kill the Poor, the Memoir. The main message that he wants to push to elites is that the poor are lazy, and he's somehow disguising this as a call to action for the poor at the same time. The poor are hardworking people, just as much as anybody else. And the fact that JD is making an entire book to say that they're not is really insulting to all of them and the hard work that they do every single day. The economy doesn't work without human participation. The least you can guarantee is giving them a livable wage. Lack of industry is now somehow self-inflicted, and then using exaggerated anecdotal stories to then prove his point. Hey dude, the only thing that you proved is that you have like 8 Hunter Bidens in your family. And I can't believe I have to say this, but economic problems are just that, economic. 3 in 5 Appalachian counties experienced declining employment in the past 20 years, some as bad as 50%. The average income rates of Appalachian families are 20% below the national average, and almost every Appalachian state has maintained the federal minimum wage of $7.25, then writing an entire book just to try and blame it on working class people. And in retrospect, I question how this book gained national attention in the first place, especially when the message is so flawed and the proof is right there. Editing Sam again here. Hi. I do want to add that I've been watching his speeches since becoming the nominee, and it's clearly he is as confusing in real life as he is in the book. One of the major gripes with his VP candidacy so far is that he has no charisma and often looks like he doesn't even believe in what he's saying. And that creates the numerous awkward situations that I sprinkled throughout this video today. This is more of a major problem than I think many Republicans realize, because if Kamala picks an Andy Beshear or a Josh Shapiro to be her VP, and they go up in a debate, JD is getting his ass handed to him, and it won't be close. And that's what's so infuriating about him in this book. is that he's so fake. He's not being honest with us. He's not being honest with the American people. And most importantly, he's not being honest with himself. He's like if Dan Quayle was homeschooled and locked in a cupboard every night instead of going to bed. But yeah, let's get back. I think at the time, we were willing to believe anything because we were so devoid of an actual reasonable explanation to the rise of Donald Trump. Although conservatives are loving the book now, it was liberals who were pushing this book in 2016. It was the liberal media who made him. Did you forget he was a never-Trumper already? Because I didn't. Essentially, if you want to read a book about addiction from a person who's never been through addiction, a book about poverty from a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, and a book about Appalachia from a person who never lived in Appalachia, then this is the perfect book for you. And with that, I think I'm gonna be done today. I know this was probably rough to sit through, both reading-wise and plus the fact I'm not even a YouTuber. I'm a politics nerd who read this book and was surprised that nobody was talking about it. Maybe I'll be back to make more videos, but that just depends on how this one performs. So yeah, thanks for watching, stream my music, and don't vote for JD Vance. Bye.